Welcome. My name is Eugene Meyer. I'm the president of the Federalist Society, and we are delighted to welcome you to this discussion we have upcoming between Professor George and Professor West. I will say before we start, after the discussion, which will be about an hour, we will turn on the chat function so you can type in questions, keep your questions short, include your name and affiliation, and we will read as many of them as we can. I'm going to be very brief on the introductions because you want to hear from our two guests, two of the leading public intellectuals in the country. Professor Robert George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton. Professor Cornel West is professor at Harvard and has been at any institution had so many titles I've lost track. But we are delighted to have the type of serious discussion and exploration that we always want to have, and is especially needed at this stage. I am going simply to turn it over to them, and they are going to take the lead in whichever way they see fit. So, without further ado, I should have said which one of you is going first. But I will let you settle that.
Well, let me jump the queue and begin, Gene. And let me begin by thanking you, Gene, you're such a dear friend, and the Federalist Society for this opportunity for Professor West and me to join you today and to join your audience. I wish I could say that I was among the founders of the Federalist Society. I wasn't, but I've been a friend and an admirer of the society and a participant in its events, at least since the early 1990s. And the Federalist Society has done such enormous good for the cause of constitutionalism, for the rule of law, for legal education, and for the practice of law in the country. It's a genuine and huge success story, and I am proud of my affiliation with it. And I'm absolutely delighted. It's always a pleasure to be on with my dear friend and brother Cornel West, but I'm delighted to be joining him here at a Federalist Society event. Cornel's profile is not one that is commonly associated with the Federalist Society, but he is somebody who Federalist Society people need to know about, need to understand, need to engage, and need to learn from. And at the deepest level, he shares something fundamental with Federalist Society folk. It's what he shares with me. It's a commitment to truth-seeking, whether that's in legal education, whether it's in the arts and sciences, whether it's in any of the other schools of professional education. Cornel believes, and I believe, in truth-seeking. And we're going to talk about some of the conditions that have to be in place in institutions for them to be truth-seeking institutions. He also shares my commitment and the Federalist Society's commitment to the rule of law and to Republican government, to what these days we tend to call democracy, what our founding fathers preferred to call Republican government. The participation of the ruled in the enterprise of ruling, governing ourselves, being free people in free institutions. Cornel and I have built not only a friendship, but a very powerful and fruitful partnership, teaching courses together at Princeton, going around the country, lecturing together, writing together on the basis of those shared commitments. And it's really been among the greatest joys in my life to work with Cornel and to learn from him. And not only to learn from him in the traditional sense, when we talk about Plato or St. Augustine or Luther or Marx or Hayek or Dewey or Lewis, as we do in our classes, but also learning from the example that he sets of truth-seeking, of integrity, of standing up for what he believes, speaking out even when it's unpopular with people on his side of the ideological divide. Cornel and I both have plenty of experience with tribalism and with being something of a dissenter within the tribe and sometimes suffering the consequences of deviating from the tribe's view on this or that or the other thing. That takes integrity, and Cornel has modeled that, and it's benefited me to learn from his example there. Before I turn it over to Cornel for some opening remarks of his own, I want to quote the most recent piece that Cornel and I did together. It appeared in the Boston Globe as a kind of op-ed piece, and it was called Honesty and Courage. I won't take the time to read the entire text to you. I hope that people who are interested in what Cornel West and I do together will look up Honesty and Courage, the op-ed in the Boston Globe, and read it. We also have an audio version of it that's published by the James Madison program at Princeton, posted as a kind of podcast. We call it Madison's Notes. But I will read just the opening part of it because it reflects the commitments that bring us together, that bind us together. These are commitments we had no trouble hammering out together. We didn't have to go word by word or line by line to reach agreement. They're things that we deeply share and that are at the foundation of our own personal vocations. And I believe they're things that are shared with folks associated with the Federalist Society. So let me just read a few of the opening paragraphs. Honesty and courage alone can save our wounded, disunited country now. We need the honesty and courage to speak the truth, including painful truths that unsettle not only our foes, but also our friends and ourselves. We need the honesty and courage to honor the contributions of great men and women who have gone before us, those who articulated and defended true principles of justice and the common good, built or helped to preserve worthy institutions, and modeled important virtues. We need the honesty and courage to recognize the faults, flaws, and failings of even the greatest of our heroes, and to acknowledge our own faults and flaws and failings. We need the honesty and courage to recognize the progress toward the ideal of equal justice and movement toward the common good that our civilization and nation have made, and the blows against injustice, oppression, and tyranny that we as a people have struck, sometimes at incalculable costs of blood and treasure. We need the honesty and courage to recognize the blights on our history, the grave wrongs that have been done, reflecting the failure of our leaders and institutions and our own failures to honor our principles of liberty and justice for all. We need the honesty and courage to express dissent, to say, no, I will not go along, when conscience tells us that our own ideological or political tribe has gone astray or gone too far or become fanatical and blind to integrity and the dignity of all. And we go on from there, but that will give you a sense of the important values and virtues that unite the two of us, that have been at the foundation of the bond that has enabled us to do our work together, teaching, lecturing, and writing, and that we think are so desperately needed just now in our country precisely because it is so deeply wounded and disunited, polarized in ways that are all too reminiscent of the dangerous period at the turn of the century between the 18th and 19th centuries, as reflected, for example, in the election of 1800, and then the really terrible division that produced the horrible Civil War with all of its carnage. Our colleague, the distinguished historian of the Civil War at Princeton, James McPherson, says 750,000 deaths in the Civil War. Now, we pray to God that we will not experience something like that or anything like that. And yet we have to be vigilant. And there are evils that we need to avoid, even falling short of that kind of bloodshed. The very success of our experiment in ordered liberty, this American experiment bequeathed to us by our founders in ordered liberty and Republican government, is at stake today. If we continue to treat each other not as fellow citizens who happen to disagree about important matters, but as enemies to be defeated and indeed destroyed, then we will not only destroy each other, we will destroy this precious experiment in ordered liberty and Republican government. So our message today, and our message in all our work together, is we can do this. We can do better. We can restore the conditions, revalorize the virtues and the values that are needed to carry on this wonderful experiment, which by its nature, as any experiment, can fail, but in whose success we ought to be deeply vested. And for the sake of whose success, we ought to be willing to bear any burden and pay any price, make any sacrifice, take any risk, because it's worth it. Cornel, let me turn it over to you.
No, thank you so much. I want to begin by just saluting Brother Eugene for allowing us to have this conversation. We've been at it for 15 years, and we intend to be at it until the worms get our bodies, because we want to be forces for real good as we understand our distinctive callings and vocations. Also want to acknowledge Brother Charles, who is behind the scene, but doing a wonderful job with his mask on and things. But anytime I get a chance to be in dialogue with my dear brother Robbie, it puts a smile on my face. Because at the deepest moral and spiritual level, it's a chance to both enjoy but also exemplify the fact that love is in no way reducible to politics, and that brotherhood is in no way reducible to agreement on various public policy. I think he's wrong on a number of things. He thinks I'm wrong on a number of things. We revel in wrestling with the arguments, the evidence, the stories, the narrative, the analysis that we have, but we come together on something that I think is just so crucial. And it's even more than a common ground. More and more, it's a kind of precondition for any conception of civilized interactions. And it's basic virtues. Socratic legacy of Athens, indispensable. Examine life is not worth living. Self-scrutiny, intellectual humility, recognizing you could be wrong even as you take a strong stand, so that humility and tenacity can go hand in hand alongside an acknowledgement of our fallibility. And this Socratic legacy that unleashed just unprecedented energies of critical reflection of what the great Alfred North Whitehead in that wonderful book that we have our students read over and over again, Adventures of Ideas, a noble discontent, a critical discontent that again is not reducible to right wing, left wing, centrism, liberalism, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and so forth. You see, basic virtues. You know, Alistair McIntyre used to say, there's only two conditions under which people ought to talk about defending basic virtues: when things are not going well and when things are going well. And McIntyre is absolutely right about that. And that's very much what Brother Robbie and I are all about in terms of our teaching, our conversations. We've been on chocolate sides of town in Dallas. We've been on vanilla sides of town all through Colorado, California, and what have you. We interact with our brown brothers and sisters. We talk about suffering about indigenous brothers and sisters, but it's not at the level of identity. Mm-hmm. It's at the level of integrity, of decency, of honesty, of truth seeking, and of a justice seeking. But we understand from Reinhold Niebuhr, any justice as the only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. Justice is rescued only by something deeper. Love, Shakespeare, Merchant of Venice, mercy, cuts much deeper than just talk about justice. You're only talking about justice, you lo and behold, you're going to weaponize it in such a way that you end up reproducing so much of the greed, the corruption, the indifference, the callousness that you were initially opposing. And so we're always concerned about that reptilian character of quest for justice, quest for the good, quest for the truth, in the ways in which we must have a robust, uninhibited public space. I mean, Walt Whitman's magnificent text of Democratic Vistas talks about there has to be a public space where human beings and citizens can enter without humiliation and engaging in disagreement by listening intensely and trying to persuade, that pitho that the Greeks highlighted versus the bia, the centrality of persuasion rather than just forced coercion and violence. But on the other side, of course, is the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. And we talk about this all the time. Why it is that Socrates never sheds a tear. Why does Jeremiah cry and Jesus weeps? That legacy that goes through the Hebrew scripture, the Hebrew scripture being the great moral revolution in the species that says to be human is to spread hesed, steadfast love, loving kindness to the widow, the fatherless, the motherless, the poor, the vulnerable, the persecuted. And Jesus building, Muhammad building, and even our secular brothers and sisters who can recast love in terms of benevolence, be it a Hume, or recast it in different language of empathy and so forth. But these two fundamental pillars constitute preconditions of any kind of civilized, let alone democratic project in which people who are viewed as having dignity and a sanctity that must be affirmed regardless of color, nation, sexual orientation, regardless of class, at the deepest level of what it means to be human. And as Christians, we talk about it in terms of Imago Dei, but we know Christians have no monopoly, even theoretically, philosophically, or practically, on access to these legacies. It's just that we situate and locate ourselves within these legacies as persons who are deeply concerned about a democratic experiment that has always been fragile. It is now at its low point. It is now at its nadir. Maybe the worst since Lincoln. And it's clear we have no Lincoln coming around the corner. When you look at both political parties, we can get into more concrete details about that. So it's a spiritual decay. It's a moral decay that needs to be addressed, even as we recognize our political and ideological differences and so forth. And it has to be exemplified. We try to be sermons as much as give sermons in that regard. People have to be able to see Brother Robbie and I reveling in each other's humanity and intellect and moral sensibility and so on, and yet also coming down, oftentimes in very different places politically. But things are looks like they're getting worse and worse, though, brother. You know what I mean? Is that a fair characterization, you think?
It sure is in my view, Cornel. It sure is.
Yeah.
Our country went through a Great Depression, terrible circumstances. Our fathers grew up in it. Mine certainly did. I think yours did. Those were tough times, and of course it was politically divisive at the same time. It was not all just lions laying down with the lambs, but not in the polarized, extreme way that we find it today. Not with the attitude of hatred of citizen to citizen, the desire to destroy the opposition, not simply to win a political contest. This is what makes it worse in my view, and why we should be, not only concerned but frankly alarmed about it. Look, there are important public policy issues that we have to resolve. Health policy, tax policy, the whole question of industrial policy, regulatory policy, social policy, social issues. There are many, many important issues that divide us politically. But there needs to be some fundamental agreement about the proper way we go about resolving these disputes. This is a Federalist Society point, Gene Meyer. Federalist Society is concerned about process, not just outcomes. Outcomes are very, very, very important, but process is important too. And we mustn't imagine that there's morality and process and those two are different. Moral judgments, moral questions have to do with process as well as with policy outcomes. And I think we can divide what I'm here referring to as process, speaking very roughly, not using the term technically, into two sorts of things. One are democratic procedures, the constitutionally prescribed procedures of Republican democracy for resolving our disputes. It's critically important that those norms be secured and that they be observed. We can't just worry about outcomes and then seek to get the right outcomes as we see it at any cost or by any means necessary. We need to preserve and protect and honor those norms of democratic decision making. And then the second thing is a serious respect that is needed for the cultural as well as legal protection of civil liberties. Not just because, although this is an important aspect, individual people have individual rights to freedom of speech and to freedom of assembly and to freedom of religion and so forth. But the reason, or part of the reason, that we have and should recognize those rights is that their recognition is critical to the functioning of Republican democracy, as it is critical, or they are critical, to the function of truth-seeking in places like universities. So Cornel and I live our lives, people refer to us as public intellectuals. I sometimes wonder quite what that means, but we live our lives, doing our work in the public sphere, in politics, the area that's concerned with public policy, and then in the world of education and scholarship and learning. And in both of those domains, there are certain virtues and values that need to be in place. They're conditions for the success of the enterprise. And those include freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, including freedom of religion, freedom of discussion, freedom of thought, very fundamentally, freedom of assembly. Unless we have those things, say in universities, there can be no truth-seeking. All there will be is power and ideology. We'll get dogma, sure, plenty of that. We'll get entrenched orthodoxies, you bet we'll get that. We'll get manipulation, where people try to use universities and the authority of universities and the authority of university offices and the authority of the classroom to push their partisan agenda. What you will not get is truth-seeking. What you will not get is learning. What will happen to students? They'll be indoctrinated. They won't be taught. They won't be taught to think deeply and critically and for themselves. The concern will be to make sure they get what the teacher thinks or the professor thinks is the right answer. And all he'll be concerned about is getting that right answer into the kid's head. That is indoctrination. It's the very opposite of education. It's antithetical to education. Now look over on the public sphere in the domain of Republican democracy. What happens when, and it doesn't have to be de jure, it can actually just be de facto. It can be cultural and not legal. People may enjoy the right to freedom of speech, but as a practical matter, they don't have it because they live in fear of bullying and intimidation, of losing their jobs, for example, if they say the wrong thing or say the right thing in the wrong way, or don't say the thing that they're supposed to be required to say as some sort of loyalty oath or pledge. What will happen? Well, you won't get a functioning Republican democracy. You'll get dogma, and you'll soon have oppression, and you soon have tyranny. And the chances of making good decisions, decisions that are for the sake of the common good, which is, of course, among the central goals of a democratic republic, those odds will be very greatly diminished. It will all be about power and getting our way and putting our group or clan or tribe on top. If we embrace that kind of politics, layer onto it identitarianism, it'll all be my tribe fighting against your tribe in order to gain dominance and exercise power, and your rights be damned. We don't want that. That is not what this republic is for or all about. And at our best moments, it's the opposite of what we have been. So even in the effort to reform what is wrong and needs reform, needs to be fixed, even in the effort to overcome past injustices or current injustices, we need to adhere strictly to norms like the basic civil libertarian norms of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of thought and freedom of discussion. And we need to protect and honor the norms of democratic governance. We can't try to rule and win by any means necessary. So Cornel and I could spend a lot of time, we do spend a lot of time, usually late at night in hotel rooms after we do our talks together over a glass of wine. We can argue about what's the best way to provide health care to millions and millions of Americans. How much of it should be the government? How much of it should be the market? We can argue about that. It's important. And we're going to have to make that decision as a society, as a polity. We can argue about tax policy. We can argue about social issues. But we're now facing a situation where the fundamental premises that can make those arguments fruitful are being undercut. Democracy is being eroded. True democratic values are being eroded. Civil liberties are being eroded. Not so much de jure, there's still a First Amendment, it's still there in the law, the courts will enforce it, but de facto, people living in fear, people being subjected to bullying and intimidation in universities and elsewhere when they speak their minds. And so this is why Cornel and I have spoken out so forcefully on these so-called procedural questions. We think they're of profound moral importance. They're not merely procedural. Cornel, have I summed it up?
No, absolutely. I mean, again, we go back to the Greeks, the parrhesia, the free speech, the unintimidated speech, the fearless speech. It's not just free speech, but it's a speech that is informed by respect for the other and empathy for the other. But most importantly, it is a speech to be protected. That's why civil liberties and rights are the precondition of any talk of a civilized society, let alone a democratic society, which means, of course, when you look at human history, oh, that series of crimes and follies that Gibbon talked about, or that slaughterhouse that Hegel talks about in his lectures. History has been a slaughterhouse, he says, a Schlachtbank. That yes, it has been. Why? Because of so much greed, so much fear, insecurity translated into domination. And that's the raw materials of history that we're dealing with. How to create a countervailing force. That's where you have liberty, Republican government, democracy, egalitarian sensibilities, let alone kindness, sweetness, gentleness, those things that are worth living and dying for. So we've got a philosophical anthropology here that's very important. It does pit Socrates against Thrasymachus. If Thrasymachus can convince Glucon and the younger generation, might makes right, then you will end up, as Martin Luther King used to say, with an obsession with thou shalt not get caught, the 11th commandment, and survival of the slickest. You can't have a democracy, you can't have a culture, you can't have trust, empathy without that. You can't even have personal relationships without that. You see, and this is part of why we're in such trouble. I mean, when you have a thoroughly commodified culture, it doesn't leave space for non-market values like love and trust and kindness and sweetness and so forth. Then what's left? I mean, good God. And of course, Brother Robbie's a great musician, and I think that I am in the shower. And you got the music, the arts remind us that there's got to be spheres that Thrasymachus cannot in any way invade. Mike cannot be right. Socrates has to convince the younger generation integrity must have a space, even if it leads toward the hemlock. Or Jesus has to convince the Roman empires. There's got to be a space, even if the only space for me is a manger and a cross. I'm going to leave that legacy of a love of neighbor, a love of stranger, a love of the other, as it were. And of course, that goes back to Leviticus. That's Hebrew scripture that Jesus is building on. But most importantly, I think in America these days, we have to acknowledge the juxtaposition between the Grand Inquisitors. That's Dostoevskian terrain, you see. The ones who know that they're doing wrong, but have given up on that quest. And so they're the disillusioned believers who are manipulating, using that miracle and mystery and authority for tyranny and mystification and subordination. That's the inside of Dostoevsky. And then here comes John Stuart Mill on liberty. We've got to have robust, uninhibited conversation across the board with no manipulation from those who have given up on the quest for truth, for goodness, for beauty, and for Christians like ourselves, the religious folk, for the holy or for God. So in that sense, we need a witness bearing that cuts across politics and ideology at a moment in which a democracy is seemingly going under. And one cannot be more insistent on this, it seems to me. And we have to be able to speak to our young people and get them to see that it's not just power, that these vulgar versions of Michel Foucault, and I think Michel Foucault is a fascinating thinker and so forth, but gets appropriated in these vulgar ways. So he becomes the footnote to Thrasymachus.
Yeah,
The worst
exactly.
thing you want. The worst thing you want, no matter how fancy, sophisticated, refined, and subtle you think he is. No, he's talking about power, 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 power. He's not talking about integrity. He's not talking about honesty. He's not talking about decency. He's not talking about trying to understand power always already exists. We know that, but it can't be the end all and be all. Something else has got to be at stake when you're talking about love, when you're talking about justice, when you're talking about democracy, when you're talking about community, when you're talking about those things that people in the past have been living to live and die for, and many continue today. And we debate about what do we mean by domination? There's domination by the nation state. Yes, Hayek is right. There's domination by the market. Hayek's got to rethink sometimes. Oh, you're not really highlighting the domination by the big corporations the way you're talking about domination by the nation state. We can learn from Frederick, but he can learn from R.H. Taney. He can learn from the folk who look, he can learn from Chesterton. He can learn from the folk who are looking at all these different forms of domination. White supremacist domination, vicious. Learn a whole lot from Du Bois and the others. Male supremacist domination and so forth and so on. Losing sight of humanity of Jewish brothers and sisters. 2,000 years of a hated people. How do you keep track of their humanity? And yet they're human beings as well, which means that they also can contribute to domination too. That's one of the reasons why Brother Robbie fight for the right of Noam Chomsky to be wrong. I fight for the right of Brother Rush Limbaugh to be wrong. Now, I think Chomsky is also going to be right. You think Rush is probably less right than I think Chomsky is. That's all right. We have a drink over it. We work it out. But we fight for their right to be wrong. And yet we hold up the standards. None of them going to be Thrasymachus as long as we're alive. We're going to push that back. None of them going to be Grand Inquisitors as long as we're alive. We're going to push that back. They have a right to attempt to be, but any injurious harm that flows, any contribution to ways in which they are trumping or foreclosing the voices of others, then we defend those voices. And of course, I come from a people of Black people whose anthem is lift every voice, it's not lift every echo. Let the echo chambers go. Quit imitating Monk Toe Coltrane. Find your own voice. Play yourself. Ah, that sounds like Ralph Waldo Emerson too. That sounds like Muriel Rukeyser too. That sounds like Whitman too. Find your own voice like your fingerprint. Robbie has his voice. I got my voice. We bring our voices together, but we're not echoes. We're not echoes for right wing, left wing, Republican Party, Democratic Party. No, we human beings who come from our mamas and our daddies. And Robbie's got magnificent parents. I met him in the office of Brother John Roberts in the Supreme Court when you were inaugurated that day. That was a beautiful day with Harriet Tubman's Bible. That was a magnificent.
Yeah, what Cornel is referring to here was a wonderful day, Gene. I was elected chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and Chief Justice Roberts kindly agreed to swear me into the office. And so I wanted to be sworn in on a historically important Bible. Now, all Bibles are important. I'm not ranking Bibles, but I wanted to be sworn into office, especially given the human rights nature of the enterprise, on the Bible of an important human rights hero. And Harriet Tubman is somebody I've always especially admired. So I got in touch with Harriet Tubman House, the little museum in her honor in Auburn, New York, on the Underground Railroad, and they seemed to be pretty happy to hear from me. And not that there was anything special about me; it's just that they're up there and they don't get nearly as much attention as some of the other important museums and sites. So they welcomed the phone call, and they got especially excited when I told them the next part of it, which is that I wanted to borrow the Bible, Harriet Tubman's Bible, to be sworn in on, and that Brother Cornel West had agreed to hold the Bible for me when I was sworn in. They were really excited about that, as well they should have been. And so on that beautiful day, we went to the Supreme Court. My parents were there. My wife and some of my other family were there. And Chief Justice Roberts kindly swore me in on Harriet Tubman's Bible, with Brother Cornel holding the Bible there in his chambers. You know, Cornel, when you were talking about Foucault, so influential in the late 20th and early 21st century in academic life. And I'll confess, I actually have found some of what he says interesting, and I have to confess I've learned some things from Foucault.
Absolutely, he's a brilliant mind.
But you know, he's also been a powerfully corrupting force, and some of the worst movements, I think, in intellectual life have followed his path. And I think what that reflects, and you put your finger on what the problem is, it puts the premium on power. It reduces everything in the end to power. I think behind that is a giving up on the idea of truth, an abandonment, a loss of faith in the concept of truth. If we don't really believe there's a truth to be discovered, well, then we're not going to look for it. And what we're going to be concerned about is not actually finding the truth and getting ourselves into line with the truth and reforming our thinking if in view of the best investigation and reflection, we find ourselves in error. We're rather going to be just trying to prevail, trying to win, exercise power, dominate, oppress other people. I think that's where that kind of so-called postmodernism or deconstructionism, which Foucault so heavily influenced, really leads in the end. And I think it's attached to this concept of identitarianism, which we both have been criticizing. You know, so much of our politics today has descended into identity politics. It's making sure my tribe or my group or my clan, my crowd wins and gets domination, gets the dominant position over other people, because in the end, that's all it is a game in which the sides vie to lord it over everybody else. We've got to resist that. Now, it used to be that people were worried about the concept of truth because they thought that if people believed in the truth, then they would believe they have the truth, and then they're going to oppress everybody else in the name of truth. But you know, the reality is, among the great truths is the truth that all of us can know the truth only imperfectly. All of us are fallible. We can all be wrong. The great traditions of truth seeking, whether they're religious or secular, whether we're talking about the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, or the Platonist or the Greek tradition, all of these traditions have taught human fallibility, even as they teach the importance of truth and truth seeking. And it's that combination. It's recognizing that there is a truth, but we can't know it perfectly. And we're prone to error, we're prone to fallibility, which is the thing that actually underwrites and supports the importance of freedom, the importance of recognizing other people's rights to pursue the truth, the importance of being willing to be challenged as well as to challenge those we think are wrong, that underwrites the importance of being willing to change our minds under the pressure of reason and argument. It's the understanding that enables us to see that there is a proper currency of discourse, whether it is intellectual discourse in the academy or political discourse in the public square. And that currency is a currency of reasons and evidence and argument. People may radically disagree, but if they are conducting their disagreement in the proper currency, argument, reasons, evidence, they're united in the truth-seeking bond, even though they disagree, they can't go too far wrong. That'll be the thing that keeps everybody in the game.
And that is so crucial, because I mean, look at the history of the West in terms of its philosophical tradition. Chapter 17 of Machiavelli's The Prince. Learn how to be feared rather than loved, cruelty and compassion. He's talking about power. Clausewitz's philosophy of war. He's talking about power. Foucault has no monopoly on this. He's a footnote. He's a French footnote. I don't want to get chauvinistic here, but he's a French footnote to it. He is a genius. He's a towering figure, but he could be wrong. They have a role in the dialogue, but when they set the conditions for the whole dialogue, that's something else. Yeah. Nietzsche could come along and say, I'm concerned about the value of truth itself. Is the quest for truth willing to be truthful about itself? That's the Nietzschean question. That's a profound question. I think Nietzsche's wrong, come on in, Frederick. Let's have a dialogue about it. But he's not going to set the conditions for the whole dialogue, because then at that point it's just a matter of will to power, will to power, will to power, will to power. So it's not as if somehow, what has happened is that you get crude appropriations of Foucault and the others, crude appropriation of Nietzsche, crude appropriation of all of these towering figures. Look at the crude appropriation of Leo Strauss, who took Nietzsche so seriously that he had to leave and becomes one of the great critics of Nietzsche. Understand his trajectory, understand what he's wrestling with at the deepest level. All of these towering figures oftentimes get deodorized and sanitized, and they get crudely appropriated, and it becomes just a matter of the younger generation of Glucon and Demetrius and the others these days in the past going off in ways in which it make it difficult for the kind of public dialogue, let alone public life. And there is no democracy without high quality public conversation, public life, public interaction. I didn't say transaction. That's too marketable. Interaction for transformation. Markets play their role, absolutely. When markets take over and become ubiquitous, you got spiritual emptiness, moral vacuity across the board. And that's, I think, one of the places where we are now. And it's a very, very sad place to be. But we can bounce back. By example, we can bounce back.
No, I know we can bounce back, but it seems to me that one of the areas in which we've failed, and this is a problem with the culture, with parents, with teachers, with coaches, it's a problem with the universities, is we've failed to inculcate in our young people, perhaps because we failed to exemplify it in ourselves, the older generation, a sense of self-criticism, a sense of humility and intellectual humility, an understanding that I might be wrong. And when we fail to do that, when we do not inculcate in our young people that self-critical spirit, they will become dogmatic, they will become cocksure of themselves, and that energy that comes with youth can be unleashed in impressively oppressive and even tyrannical ways. And I think we're seeing an awful lot of that now, where our young people are sure they're right and will not listen to somebody on the other side, will not listen to a challenge. They imagine that if anybody disagrees with them, they must have some malicious motive, unless they're just idiots, because it's self-evident what the truth is. I know the truth, and I'm going to march off. Of course, they don't really believe in truth. If you question them on the idea of truth, they don't really believe in truth. They believe in my truth and your truth, and yet they are willing to impose and to violate the civil liberties of people who disagree because they are so certain of their rectitude, of their virtue. We need to encourage our young people and exemplify it for them ourselves, the self-critical spirit, being willing to listen to someone on the other side, being open to argument and to reason and to evidence, being willing to change one's mind. I think it's just critical that we get there. Otherwise, there's not going to be a sense of balance and perspective, and people are going to be running after fashions and trends. And fashions and trends, are bad enough when we're talking about T-shirts and tennis shoes. They get really bad when they infect the domain of intellectual life, and really, really bad when they infect the domain of political life. And we're doing what we're doing and thinking what we're thinking because it's what's in fashion and it's because it's what the trend is, and not because we've thought our way there, not because our critical intelligence takes us there. This is what worries me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I know you and I could go on for hours. We just need a little cognac. We continue on. But is this a good time to open it up for questions and queries, Brother Eugene?
Thank you very much. It was exactly what I was thinking. I'm going to tell our audience we're now turning the chat feature on, so you can submit your questions by text. Please keep your questions short.
While you're doing that, Gene, let me take this opportunity to share with your participants a little story about the origins of the op-ed that Cornel and I did for the Boston Globe on honesty and courage, because I think it might be interesting to people. This op-ed began life after Princeton University announced that it was removing Woodrow Wilson's name from the famous public policy school at Princeton University that was formerly known as the Woodrow Wilson School. And the reason for this, the reason that demands had been made that Wilson's name be removed, was that Wilson did have a terrible record on race. He resegregated the bureaucracy of the federal government. He was certainly a racist. And so demands have, for the past several years, been made that his name be removed. Now, Woodrow Wilson, as Gene and Cornel both know, and I'll imagine most participants know, is not a beloved figure among conservatives. Quite the opposite. He was a progressive icon when I was a boy, and well, for most of my life, he's been regarded as a progressive icon. Certainly one of the founding fathers of the 20th century progressive movement. But the pressure to remove the name was coming from the left, as it were, based on race. Well, Cornel West, the famous progressive public intellectual, called me when this news was released and said, Brother Robbie, I'm concerned about this. I'm skeptical about this decision. First of all, I'm skeptical about the way it was made. It was just suddenly handed down. A few years ago, a very careful deliberation had been done. A committee had been formed. The committee reported on the question, recommended, which the university accepted, that they keep the name Woodrow Wilson on the school, not to celebrate Wilson's racism, which nobody, of course, approves of, but rather to acknowledge his contributions to the life of the university. He built Princeton University into a major research university. The reason that we're not a small liberal arts college, not that there's anything wrong with small liberal arts colleges, I went to one myself, Swarthmore, but the reason that Princeton is what it is today, a world-renowned major research university, really is that Woodrow Wilson had the vision to build it into that, and that's why they were honoring. And then suddenly, under the pressure coming out of the George Floyd episode, Princeton University suddenly removes his name. Cornel was concerned about that. He was concerned about the way it was done, and he was concerned about doing it. So we talked for a while about that. I shared both of Cornel's concerns. We both reflected on the importance of recognizing that all human beings, starting with ourselves, are a mix. There's nobody who's perfect, and in fact, most of us are very, very, very imperfect. When we celebrate a hero, whether it's George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or Harriet Tubman, for that matter, when we celebrate a hero, we don't celebrate their flaws, even though they have flaws. They're human beings. We celebrate their achievements, the good that they did. So we kicked that around for a while. And the original thought, Cornel, was that we do a piece on this, on the Wilson School issue and on the naming of buildings. But as we reflected on it together more and more, it became clear that this was just a small part of a much larger problem, which reflects a loss, a failure of honesty and courage, which leads to imbalanced views about these things, an inability to think critically and in a nuanced way about issues like statues and renaming buildings and so forth. And so that's why, as I read at the beginning of this conversation, we said that we need honesty and courage to honor the great contributions of men and women who have gone before us, who've articulated and defended true principles of justice, helped to preserve our institutions. This is what we think about when we think about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King. We don't honor Washington for being a slave owner. We don't honor Martin Luther King for his, what we now know were bad way of treating women. We don't honor people for their faults. We honor, say, a Washington or a King for the great things they did, for the courage they exemplified, for the leadership that they offered, for the witness that they gave. But at the same time, we do acknowledge their faults, and that's why the next paragraph was, we need the honesty and courage to recognize the faults and flaws and failings of even of the greatest of our heroes, and acknowledge our own faults and flaws and failings. And then the rest of the piece really does that kind of nuancing and balancing. And our diagnosis of that is the reason people are failing to provide that kind of nuance and balance, to think these things through in a nuanced and balanced way, to go with the trends and the fads and the fashions and the passions. The reason is there's a failure, there's a lack of honesty and courage.
I mean, and remember, there was a concern about that integrity of the process, because as a graduate student at Princeton in the mid-'70s, we'd put forward the same argument. And we were concerned about the validity of the argument, not just power being pushed one way or the other. When the students took over the president's office and so forth, and I had paid for their rooms in Nassau Inn when they were under threats and so forth, it was a matter of making sure they had a right to protest, making sure that they were treating people with dignity and dealing with the consequences of their actions. But it was the argument. When you had executive declaration with no faculty consultation, and that's what happened with Brother Chris. And I love Brother Chris, but I'm very critical of him when he just executive declaration and no serious faculty consultation. Then it doesn't come from the democratic reflection and dialogue that's required to understand exactly why Brother Woodrow Wilson's name is no longer on there. People need to understand. It can't just come from the top.
Yeah, this goes back to that point I was trying to make earlier.
It's got to be an organic process. I'm already critical of the imperial presidency. I don't care whether it's Republican or Democrat. I can't stand imperial executive power. It's unaccountable. Moral principles. Same is true for presidents. Now, of course, much less might be at stake, but it's still a moral issue, you see. And so when we talked and you said, no, I want to cast it broader, I said, oh, that's Brother Robbie being visionary again. Oh, yeah, that's Brother Robbie being visionary. And you were right in terms of how we ended up casting it in the broader light, and I'm glad. And we should also note, New York Times wouldn't take it.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, no, New York Times, what are you talking about? We don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, Cornel's talking about our op-ed. I mean, when
Washington Post wouldn't take it. Wall Street Journal wouldn't take it.
Yeah.
So we said, oh, God, honesty and courage is so out of fashion. Thank God we had Sister Marjorie at the Boston Globe. Who I worked for 25 years. She said, this is a very important piece. I said, my God, somebody still believes honesty and courage has weight and gravitas. That's a beautiful breakthrough. That's wonderful. It's not going to be just about what our brand is. It's about what our cause is going to be. Well, I know I'm going on and on, but I'm glad you mentioned that. That whole process. And we should also know with the Harper Magazine piece, that when Brother Mark Lilly asked me to put my name on it.
Oh, on Harper's, Harper's
Magazine.
And
Harper's piece. I said, yes, I'll put my name on it, but I'm very critical of the hypocrisy and the self-righteousness of so many of the liberals in the last 50 years or so, especially in the last 25 years or so, you see. They're not going to fight for the right of Steve Salata when he's in trouble, because he's unpopular when it comes to Middle East policy, but they're going to fight for the right of Bennett. We ought to fight for the right of both. Or when Mark Lamont Hill is being pushed out of Temple University, Brother Robbie calls me up and says, I think Mark Lamont Hill is wrong when it comes to his critique of Israel and so forth, but we must defend his rights. I said, well, I resonate with much, not all, but much of what Mark Lamont Hill's talking about, but I stand with you, Brother Robbie. We're going to defend it. And same is true if it had been a right-wing person. Charles Murray, or whoever it is, defending their rights to raise their voices. That's the kind of moral consistency and Jane Austen-like constancy that we have to be about, it seems to me. That's the origins of our...
There's a morality, there are moral issues that
they didn't include my name in that Harper's Magazine piece, and I never got an explanation. So much for commitments of our fellow liberals to different voices. If you're going to talk about parrhesia, then you have to talk parrhesia all the way down.
I hope people took this on board. I mean, this is an amazing thing to me. So Brother Cornel was invited to sign the Harper's letter, the famous Harper's letter. He was happy to sign it because he believed in the principles of freedom of speech and freedom of discussion that were articulated and defended in the letter. He told them well in advance that he was willing to sign. He put his name down. And yet the letter comes out, his name is not there. He gets in touch with the organizers of the letter to say, why is my name not there? He gets no response. I mean, what is this? What's going on here?
This is what disenchants our young people of all colors. We got to teach them, don't look for purity and full-fledged consistency. But when the hypocrisy is that flaring, then it undercuts Glucon's attention to Socrates and makes Glucon think maybe Thrasymachus is really the one that got it going on. He's the one in touch with reality. It really is might versus right. Look at all of that energy. He emerges like a lion and a tiger in the dialogue. And at the same time, he lacks integrity, honesty, decency, truth-telling, or justice-seeking. And Plato says, give me the whole dialogue, and I'm gonna show you, younger generation, that Socrates is worth at least wrestling with, maybe even affirm.
I want to, before we go to the questions, I just want to drive home, because so much of what Cornel and I have been saying, including Cornel's last point here, has to do with the importance of process. Again, it's a Federalist Society point, that we shouldn't imagine that there are moral questions and then process questions.
That's right.
That's a false dichotomy. That's a false distinction. Process itself raises moral questions. We believe in democratic processes because we believe they're the morally best processes. We believe in freedom of speech not just as a procedural matter, but because we believe it as a moral matter. So let's just try to get away from that. When we talk about questions of separation of powers, for example, those process questions, they're not, quote, just process questions or, quote, mere process questions. They're important moral questions, because process is itself a moral issue.
That's right.
Gene, over to the questions.
Yeah, we thank you. Both of you have been marvelous. We've got some very good questions here. So I'm going to start out with one from Gabrielle Weigel saying, do you have practical suggestions for approaching conversations where emotions, especially anger and victimhood, are overtaking the stage? Do you have experience you can share, maybe from interactions with students where emotions have led the argument or perspective? And another question I'm going to bunch in there too is, how do you respond to people who think that our traditional notions of free speech support oppression, particularly racial oppression? That's from Michael Wada.
Cornel, you're so good on that last one. You take that one.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of, how do we just maintain connection with the humanity of persons by trying to get inside of their skin and raising questions about their families and their plight and predicaments in terms of their smaller platoons, in Burke's language, the micro activities. Find out what kind of music they like. Find out what kind of sports they're into. You have some common ground so that your critique will be an imminent critique. It won't be viewed as just external, driven by a foe. It would be, oh, I see you love Curtis Mayfield and Bruce Springsteen and a little Mozart too. Let me tell you why you're wrong on your politics. So there's ways in which you can make that deeper connection. Oh, you're into the New York Yankees and the Knicks. I can't stand the Knicks, but the Yankees seem to be all right. We actually got something in common. And I discovered that in Charlottesville. You know the story in Charlottesville when I'm walking right across with all the various neo-Nazis, they coming at us, spitting and telling us names and Jewish this, black so-and-so, and they're listening to black music in the park. And I said, Motown has seized the mind of these neo-Nazi brothers and sisters. They spiritually sick and morally deficient, and yet somehow they've been Americanized enough to get into something profoundly American, which is the black musical tradition. There's ways in which you can inhabit somebody else's skin and space initially to then open up the more politically difficult and delicate questions. And and I think that's very important because that's what has helped hold us together.
Let me add to that it's really critically important that we disabuse our young people. And this is a job for parents, and it's a job for pastors, and it's a job for coaches, and it's a job for teachers, including professors. Disabuse our young people of the idea that their identities are shaped by their feelings or their desires or their passions. Plato taught that in the well-ordered soul, in fact, Plato is teaching here consistently with the teaching of all the great teachers of humanity, of all traditions, secular and religious, that in the properly ordered soul, emotion is under the control of reason. It's your reason that fundamentally matters. You can adjust and should adjust your emotions to keep them in line with reason. You shouldn't let emotion have the whip hand, instrumentalizing reason and turning reason into nothing more than a tool for getting what you happen to want, whatever you want, or advance your feelings, no matter what those feelings happen to be. You'll never get self-criticism if students or young people believe that their identities are constituted by their feelings and emotions. There is no critique of feelings and emotions from within. It's got to be a rational critique. They have to learn self-control. The most difficult challenge that anybody will ever face, and we all face it, the most difficult challenge for human beings is the challenge of self-mastery. It's to be master of ourselves, to get the soul, the self, properly ordered so that we're not simply the slaves of our passions, to use that famous quotation, Cornel, from Hume. We're not serfs living under the control of emotion. We have to challenge that with our young people every step of the way, at every opportunity, to get them thinking about who they really are. You see, that's what's critical. That's what teaching really should be about.
Yeah. Um, I'm sorry, there are a lot of good questions here, so I'm trying to pick some of the best ones. Professor George has shared the view that conservatives have for expressing views publicly because they might lose their jobs, et cetera. Professor West, is there a similar fear on the left?
What was that?
Professor George has shared his view that conservatives have about expressing views publicly because they might lose their jobs. Is there a similar view on the left?
Yeah, it depends on what the context is. I remember around, 9/11, I think Ward Churchill got pushed out for saying something critical. And whether you agree or disagree with him, it was important to defend his liberty. We know the history of World War I, for example, at Columbia. That was the reason why the new school was founded, because so many of the anti-war professors were pushed out. So there's a long history under the Espionage Act in which left-wing professors, Paul Sweezy, of course, was pushed out, even when his teacher, Joseph Schumpeter, supported him because of him being a Marxist. Well, that's during the McCarthyite years. And it takes whatever forms relative to circumstances, that the left can be suppressive, the left can be repressive. And when you have, right now in the universities, I think you have a kind of neoliberal hegemony, so that the leftists are still there, but they're not really hegemonic, and the conservatives are very much on the fringes. I mean, I think that's fair to say, even at Princeton, the conservative intellectuals and professors are really on the fringes, you see. And you just have to make sure, if you're going to be Socratic and prophetic, that we're embracing the high quality voices across ideological lines to make sure our young people are exposed and they begin to see the connections. There's no William Hazlitt without Edmund Burke. The real test of, Just Stop talks about this, the test of a serious leftist is to go through Edmund Burke and the others. You see, the real test of a leftist is to go through Hegel's conservative, so that, and vice versa. How you gonna be a conservative and not read Marx at all? Not read what the critique of capitalism is, where his insights are, where his conclusions you disagree, and so forth and so on. That's, I think, what's needed. And I think that on the left now, we need more progressive and leftist voices who defend voices across the board, regardless of politics and ideology.
Yeah, I mean, just at the moment, Gene, it seems to me that the most powerful threat, the thing that's really a danger to academic life, is coming mainly from the identitarian left. Now, the identitarian left activity in trying to shut down competing voices, including competing voices on the left. Remember, the so-called woke aren't just trying to get rid of the conservatives. They're trying to get rid of those on the left who aren't buying their particular form of leftism. So I think that's the real threat in the academy. But if we look at society more broadly, we see not only an identitarian left, but we also see an identitarian right. It was probably there all along. Carol Swain and Russ Neely were talking about this back in the early 2000s, and I thought this is just a minor thing if it exists at all. But it's become clear, and I think partly responsive to the rise of the identitarian left, that there is an identitarian right, sometimes called the alt-right or elements of the alt-right. But it is there, and the two are a rather toxic combination. And I wouldn't want to see either one growing. But it is true that whoever is in power, if they're given a monopoly on power in institutions, if there's not dissent present, is going to be tempted to abuse that power to repress any dissent that might arise. Cornell looks back, and he's right, to the suppression of people on the left, Marxist and non-Marxist. Non-Marxist socialists were
Oh,
also demonized
absolutely.
in
Absolutely.
World War I and the period shortly after World War I, and then again during the McCarthy period. And the McCarthy period is one that's especially instructive, and I really urge, especially young people who are tempted to this identitarianism and to the suppression of other people's speech and have gotten so dogmatic, I urge them to think about this problem. It's something I'm going to talk about right now. And that is good causes, noble causes, even the best causes can be and have been besmirched and even discredited by unjust, fanatical, extreme, tyrannical behavior. Look at McCarthy. McCarthy was acting in the name of anti-communism. Now, if you think of the history of the 20th century and the death toll, the body count, the corpses piled up by communism from 1917 on, whether we're talking about the Soviet Union, whether we're talking about China, whether we're talking about Cambodia, you can't but conclude that opposing communism, opposing Soviet totalitarianism, for example, was a very noble cause. And yet, look at how much smearing of that cause came not from communists, but from anti-communists like McCarthy, who abused their power, used unjust, unfair means, and with the result of largely discrediting, or in important ways discrediting, the anti-communist movement. When you hear the word anti-communist today, you don't necessarily think of great, noble anti-communists like Václav Havel or John Paul the Second, or some of the great anti-communist labor leaders that you will recall from the 1950s, or figures like Adlai Stevenson or John F. Kennedy. You recall McCarthy. Why is that? Why that stain? It's because McCarthy discredited, to a significant extent, a very noble and worthy cause. That can be true of civil rights. That can be true of the cause of fighting back against racial oppression or the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Your cause may be a wonderful cause, but you can tar and smear and discredit the cause yourself by bad, oppressive, tyrannical behavior in trying to advance it.
Absolutely. And you think in terms of my own democratic socialist tradition. If you start with gangsters like Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao, and you never get to Norman Thomas, Princeton graduate, class of 1905, right? You'd never get to Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote an essay called The Bravest Man I Ever Met, Norman Thomas. When you got the call from Nobel Peace Prize, don't give it to me, give it to Norman Thomas. Who's Norman Thomas? He's been around, he's been bearing witness. How come he's on the underground and the gangsters are so visible? R.H. Taney, the early Reinhold Niebuhr, we can go on and on, Helen Keller, all of those great persons who learned from the Marxist tradition. A.J. Muste was another. We heard it from Jim Lawson the other day at the funeral for John Lewis. You see, that's that deep democratic socialism that learns from Marxism, that's critical of any authoritarian repressive version of Marxism, but is also concerned about rights and liberties. Same thing on both sides. You have to have integrity in both camps, and they come together in public space for dialogue.
You're facing this right now in the democratic socialist movement with the Adolf Reed case. So here's a leading figure in that movement, has been a leading figure, important figure for years, told he's not allowed to speak at a Democratic Socialists of America event in New York. Why? Because he's not buying certain aspects of identitarianism. He's got a more old-fashioned socialist view that wants to put the emphasis on class, not race, not gender, not these kinds of things. He thinks the focus on those kinds of identitarian concerns helps to keep working class people separated by race and by sex and so forth. He's got a perfectly legitimate point of view, certainly within the world of democratic socialism has a perfectly legitimate point of view, and yet his right to speak was denied. Now, why is that? That's crazy. And we've had similar crazy stuff on the conservative side of the spectrum, but it's got to be opposed.
Craziness doesn't limit it to either side. I want to combine two other questions. One, the deepest division we see today in streets appears to be between those who accept and those who deny the existence of objective truth knowable by human reason. You two seem to stand apart from this divide precisely because you have a common understanding of objective truth knowable by human reasoning. And the second related question is, to what degree would your relationship be possible if it were not for a shared faith?
That's a really important question.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think that there's any doubt that this powerful and very fruitful bond that Cornel and I enjoy is founded on some deeply shared values. One is the commitment to truth, its objectivity, and the importance of its pursuit. Another is the belief in God and our shared Christian faith. He comes from the Protestant side of the divide. I come from the Catholic side of the divide, but we have a shared common conviction there. We believe in truth, and we also believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. That's a powerful sharing, obviously. We can feel a similar bond, I certainly do, even with non-Christians who are people of faith. For example, Orthodox Jews. Some of my dearest, closest collaborators, the people I feel most closely bonded with, are my Orthodox Jewish friends and former students, the Meir Soloveitchiks, the Daniel Marks, the David Novaks. I have this bond with some of my Muslim friends, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, for example. It gets harder when the divide gets broader, where there's not that shared understanding that there's more than this material world, that there's a higher power, that there's a spiritual realm. We can still do it, though. It's thinner, it's narrower. We can still do it, though, if we have a shared commitment to truth seeking. So my friendship with my colleague at Princeton, Peter Singer, with whom I disagree much more profoundly, even on public policy matters, than I do with Cornel. My friendship with Singer can't be built on shared faith because he's an atheist. He's absolutely convinced there's no spiritual realm, there's no more than merely human source of meaning and value. What you see is it, that's all of it. And yet he does believe in objective truth. Now, he and I disagree most of the time about what the truth is, but we've got a shared commitment to the truth and a shared commitment to seeking the truth, and so we have a shared understanding of the scholarly vocation. We have a foundation from which we can proceed to argue in a spirit of goodwill. But where that doesn't exist anymore, when somebody doesn't believe in objective truth, all they want to do is win, where they've got a dogma or a feeling that is utterly subjective. There's no way they can communicate to me. I have no access to. They're not interested in some common goal like getting at the truth. And they're not interested in a critique because they don't think there's any truth in the name of which you can criticize anybody. They just want to win. They just want power. Well, the possibility for a conversation, much less collaboration, deep, fruitful collaboration of the sort that Cornel and I have been conducting over all these years, well, that's just impossible. Well, Cornel, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a complicated matter because, on the one hand, as you know, for me, the greatest literary artist of the modern world was an agnostic named Anton Chekhov. And he had more love in him than most of my fellow Christians. Jeff Stout, our dear brother, one of the finest human beings one can ever meet, agnostic. He's got more love in him than many of my fellow Christians. Now, they believe in objective truth. That's true. But on the other hand, go back to Charlottesville. See, the neo-Nazis that we were after, it's not like they read a lot of Nietzsche. They believe in objective truth. They're just wrong as they can be. And here we are marching. We believe in the quest for truth too. And we think we're right. So I'm not sure about that question that that's the major divide. See, the major divide is what is the relation between your quest for truth and your conception of goodness and beauty that allows you to be both fallible, but also sensitive to the human status of others, no matter what their class or religion or sexual orientation or gender and so forth. And that's a moral/spiritual question. So I'm not sure about that divide being objective truth and people not believing objective truth. And therefore, somehow that cuts deeper than just an indifference.
Well, I don't think a shared commitment to objective truth is a sufficient condition for the kind of friendship and collaboration that we're interested in.
Oh, that's right.
But I think it's something pretty darn close to a necessary condition. Because if the condition is not in place, I don't see what there is other than power. I think then we're in the Nietzschean vortex.
People can be walking contradictions. I mean, for example, if you got a thick Nietzschean injection tonight and ended up agnostic, and you're still the same Robbie, I'm still gonna love you. You're still my brother. I just figured you just gone from a position that I agree with to a position that I don't agree. There are certain Nietzscheans who are living contradictions. There are certain Nietzscheans who are actually very nice and kind people. They just happen to be seduced by the text. You know what I mean? So that
I suppose there's an existential, if it's an existential practical matter, they're living as if they believed in objective truth. Then we're in. I think what a famous actor of mine appeared in The Matrix. A famous actor friend of mine appeared in.
Choosing the right peel, right?
We're probably going to have to come toward the end, and I apologize to, there are a lot of good questions I'm leaving on the table, but I did want to get one other in, or at least one other in, maybe two. But this one is, there is a pretty elaborate theory behind the refusal to debate or listen. It posits that debate and reason are themselves tools of oppression.
Oh, yeah.
And critical thinking, a trap that weakens people. They don't think it's a failure of honesty or courage because they don't think those are paramount values. What's to be done about this?
The only way to defend that claim, which you do hear with increasing frequency, which seems to me a sign of some of our pathologies, it's a symptom of our pathologies. But notice that the only way to defend that claim is by reason and argument. So to make the claim and then to try to defend it is to contradict oneself in the process. And then what are you driven to? The claim that, well, I somehow know this to be true, although there's no rational basis for my believing it to be true. So I see, in the absence of somebody coming up with some sort of even halfway plausible way of defending this that isn't self-defeating, that isn't subject to what philosophers call a retorsive argument, I just don't see how it is to be taken seriously. And if we look at the history of civil liberty, we realize that oppressed and marginalized people and groups and individuals have always relied on these freedoms, have fought for these freedoms, and then used these freedoms to lift themselves up. And their defenders have used these freedoms to defend them. I think if these identitarian folks throw over civil liberty in the hope of getting to some goal of equality that they have in mind, that will be the world's biggest example of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. No one will survive in the madness that will follow. It will be like the French Revolution consuming its own. There will be no one who in the end is not marched to the guillotine, because all of us, even those who are leading the revolution, rely on basic liberties in order to advance our causes. If we destroy them in the end, they will destroy us. Cornel, what do you think?
No, I just think there's got to be a zone for the complex and the nuanced. It's never all or nothing. Every religion we know has been used in an ugly and vicious way.
Yeah.
Every tradition we know, liberalism was used to justify imperialism. Conservatism was used to justify the right of kings or the right of elites with no accountability. But there have been rightists and conservative thinkers who were critical of those conservative deployments. So that as a Christian, the Klan uses Christianity. Does that mean that somehow there's not a space for me to somehow reside in that nuanced zone? So if they think reason can be deployed, remember Whitehead has this notion of one-eyed reason, and we want a full spectrum reason. One-eyed reason can end up justifying technology and scientificity and so forth, as if they themselves ought not be criticized. They can become dogmas themselves. debate itself, of course, debate can be used as a form of power and be deployed in ways that are highly objectionable. But what is the response? A zone of nuance and complexity in the name of rational dialogue, in the name of critical engagement, in the name of debate. And so it is with, with Judaism. My God, Judaism could be used in a variety of different ways. There's Amos and Esther and Miriam over here. And here comes Jabotinsky over here. Well, we want to dominate. No, we believe in Hesed, spreading Hesed to everybody. That includes Arabs, Palestinians, across the board. Martin Buber says yes. Einstein says yes. Maggie says yes. Well, you got some conservative Jewish brothers and sisters in Judaism say, no, we got to dominate because we've been mistreated for 2,000 years. You got a dialogue going on. Let the dialogue flower and flourish, but don't give it up to people who are just using reason, debate, religion, liberalism, democracy in vicious ways. The Soviet Union had the most beautiful constitution in the world. So what? Liberty, rights, free association is just sounding brass and tinkling cymbal. But were there folk inside of the Soviet Union who were communists themselves, who were fighting? Of course, that's what Pentecost was doing. That's what the Council of Communists were doing. Now they got their heads cut off, yes, but they went down based on integrity and principle. And that's what we got to tell our young folk. Don't tell us that all integrity is pretense. No, not at all. It sounds good in your text. Try to live it. Don't just be a spectator. Try to live that life of all integrity is pretense. What kind of relationship you gonna have? What is the relation to your students? What is the relationship to your friends? Do you really believe that, or is it just fashionable in order to say something that sounds so smart rather than wise? Unearned smartness is empty. Earned wisdom is golden. That's what we stand for.
This may lead a little bit into what's probably going to have to be our last question. Have either of you ever lost friends because of your friendship with each other? Have either of you ever been canceled because you were personal friends? Given the rise of violence in public spaces, do you ever feel unsafe in your joint public appearances? And do you fear for the personal safety of each other from violence by lone wolves? Do you expect that you will start to be canceled or boycotted as a team? Do you have a game plan if Professor George and the James Madison program at Princeton becomes a target for cancellation? The last part of this is something like, could you stand for him in that case? I think I know the answer to that question. But the core of these questions, I think, are things which are on the minds of a lot of people, including a lot of younger people. So I wanted to throw it out to both of you.
Well, when Shirley Tillman was president of Princeton University, she confided in Cornell and me that of all the letters that she got demanding that faculty members be fired and have their tenure revoked, the overwhelming majority were directed either toward Cornell or toward me. So we have that in common as well. We both, on a more sober note, we both have been targeted, and we've both been victims of serious, non-trivial threats of violence. A man went to jail for 3.5 years, went to federal prison for threatening my life and apparently taking steps to do something about that. I worry about Cornell because I know the hatred that he attracts, the malicious people who are out there. I suspect he worries about me because he knows I get some of that as well. One of the things I'll say, I've been critical of some aspects of the conservative movement, especially recently, but one thing that makes me proud of the conservative movement is my friendship with Cornell has never been a subject of criticism of me. Among conservatives. I mean, there may be people who quietly don't like it. Occasionally I'll get some nasty tweet about it on Twitter or something like that. But by and large, and I think this is a tribute to Cornell rather than me, by and large, in the conservative movement, people look favorably and applaud our work together and our friendship. And people certainly never say to me, well, how can you be friends with such a, if not never is a little true story, but very rarely will people say, how can you be friends with this guy? He's for that, he's against this, and so forth and so on. So I think the conservative movement has handled this well, and that's a good sign. Cornell, have you gotten pushback or kickback? And
I get so much pushback and kickback on so many levels. It's hard to distinguish which one is for what it is. But the thing, I come from a people who've been hated, but who dish out love at our best. And I don't ask for anybody's permission as to who I love. Yeah. And so, I love Brother Robbie. I love Brother Robbie. I take a bullet for the brother. He take a bullet for me. I pray for him. He prays for me, and Cindy and Zaytun and Cliff and so forth. That's just who we are. We stand on the promises. But I think the most important thing is we're not paralyzed by threats, and we're not surprised by what's coming at us, because we're fortified, and we fortify each other. We fortify with others, as we get fortified with others as well. And it's really more the battle. And that battle has to do with what our calling is, the truth and goodness and beauty in God. He's got a more Thomistic understanding of God. I got a more Kierkegaardian understanding of God. But we come together on that Christian ground in that way. But it's true that as things get worse, though, brother, we probably have even more vicious things coming at us. And that's just the way it is,
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as people get more and more tribal, and we've got to push back against this and make people less and less tribal, but as people get more and more tribal, it'll become more and more scandalous that Cornel and I reach across the partisan or ideological divide and embrace each other. People don't like that. The small number of criticisms I've gotten now that I'm thinking about those nasty Twitter tweets usually have a little frog symbol beside them. So I know where they're coming from. This particular racist element, I would not even count that as conservative or in the conservative movement. This is a fringe alt-right business. On the whole, I think people find it positive, in some cases maybe even inspiring, that Cornel and I are working together, that we do share these fundamental commitments to democracy and to civil liberty and to truth-seeking and the things that do bind us together. And we don't want to have monopoly on this. We don't want it to be the Cornel West and Robbie George unique thing. Not at all. We want it to be the least unique thing in all of human history. Everybody, here's from Robbie and Cornel to all of you. Reach out. Find somebody you disagree with about stuff, but with whom you have some deep bond, some deep sharing. They might be familial. They might be a religious sharing. They may be a commitment to truth seeking. Reach out and then listen to each other. It's important that we not just preach, or teach, but that we be willing to learn, that we be willing to listen, to reflect. There's this term civility, and it used to mean something rich and deep, and unfortunately, it's lost some of its meaning. It's come to be identified with mere politeness or politesse. The idea that we should politely let another person talk and not interrupt him or not shout him down, and then we'll talk. If that's the best we could settle for, I'd take that rather than us throwing bottles or worse at each other, Molotov cocktails. But it's not good enough. True civility in the old, rich sense, didn't mean just sitting quietly and politely while the other guy talked. It meant listening to the other guy.
Absolutely.
Considering what he has to say, trying to learn something from it, considering whether maybe he's right about this or partially right about it. Or even if he's not right about it, listening to the critique because it might help us to understand a little better the truths that we've basically got hold of, but maybe could use a richer understanding. John Stuart Mill, Cornel mentioned Mill earlier, Mill talks about this in Chapter 2 of On Liberty, the way we learn even from people who are wrong when they offer an intelligent, even if in the end unsuccessful, critique of what we say. So we need that true rich civility, that genuine listening to each other and learning from each other. So try to do that. It's not just for Robbie George and Cornel West. It shouldn't be some idiosyncratic weird thing. Look at these two guys. One's a conservative, one's a socialist, and they're able to be nice to each other. No, go do it yourself. Find other people that you share some bonds with, who you disagree about, and then just listen to each other.
John Boland's book, Tolerance Among the Virtues, right there at Princeton Seminary.
That's right. Former student of ours.
He's former Christian, so I don't want to be too biased in this regard. We Christians have no monopoly on any of this good stuff, but we stand in our tradition. but I'm thinking of a book that provides a way of mapping all of these different distinctions of tolerance, civility, mutual respect, and kenosis, emptying oneself, giving, donating oneself. See, that is the best of what the Judaic, Christian, and Islamic trajectory coming out of Jerusalem is. That self-surrender that generates a way of a certain kind of self-mastery tied to something bigger than oneself. And that's a larger issue, but that's still worth putting out there, I think, in a moment in which things seem to be descending so quickly. But we've got bounced back as a species, as a people, as a nation. And the United States, with all of our creativity and energy and vitality and vibrancy, if we can generate a counter bounce back against the greed and hatred and indifference, then we're really just slapping the faces of those folks who came before, who struggled so hard for us.
Yeah,
and they come in all colors.
right.
They come in all colors. They sacrifice so much.
You know,
But
this is an important point.
oh yes, oh yeah.
On the one hand, we have no guarantee of success. When our founding fathers called this an experiment in ordered liberty, when they were echoed by Lincoln and by Frederick Douglass and all the way down to Martin Luther King, when they called it an experiment, they did that knowing that experiments can fail. There's no guarantee of success. Civilizations come and go. Republics come and go.
That's right.
I mean, the big challenge for the American founders was the fact that all previous republics had failed. Think of the Roman Republic, for example. And when they failed, what did they fall into? Not some benign monarchy, into tyranny.
And the tyranny.
So we mustn't deceive ourselves and think there's some guarantee written in heaven that the American experiment in ordered liberty will succeed. If it was a guarantee that it would succeed, it wouldn't be an experiment. Our founders knew there was a risk that it would fail. But that means it's up to us to make sure it doesn't fail, because it is precious, as Cornel and I say in the Honesty and Courage piece. This is a precious thing we've got, this experiment in ordered liberty. And each generation has to make sure that it doesn't fail. It's up to us to exemplify and promote and inculcate in our young people the virtues and values that will enable it to succeed. We have it in a kind of trust. We're stewards of it. Now we have to hand it on to the next generation in good shape and teach them to hand it on to the next generation.
Well, Samuel Beckett, our blues man from Ireland. Try again, fail again.
Fail better.
Fail again, fail better.
Yeah.
Each generation is going to fail better if they're willing to sacrifice through vision, imagination, courage, and self-criticism. But you could fail worse. And we've seen so many societies fail worse.
Yeah.
Beckett understood that. He got some of that from Chekhov, you know.
I just wanted to express our enormous gratitude to both of you. You've both been just wonderful. I've been getting, as I say, half the question I haven't been able to get to. I've been getting enormous amount of praise for both of you. And this is just a wonderful discussion. I even have hopes, I recognize it probably won't work out. I'd love to have you both back at our national convention in November 12th.
In person someday, in person.
You let us know, my brother. You let us know.
We want to do it in person. If we can't do it in person, we would actually set up a professional filming thing so it looks really good. But we'd really love to have both of you. We will.
That sounds good to me, though, Brother Robbie. What do you think?
Sounds good to me, Cornel. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank God for the Bill of Rights. Oh, that's Brother Madison. Appreciate it.
There we go. Exactly.
Oh, Bill of Rights, that makes a difference now. Absolutely.
Well,
yeah. Thank you, Gene, and thanks to the Federalist Society, and thanks for all the great work the Federalist Society does.
Well, appreciate that, and this type of discussion, I hope, is an example of what we try to do. And thanks to both of you.
Oh, indeed.
Also for.
Thanks so much. God bless your family.
Yeah, God bless you, Gene.
Safe.
Thanks again.
Stay safe and strong now. Absolutely.
God bless you.